Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Hopefully you can all hear me all right. But my name is Michael Horn. I'm the co-founder of the Christensen Institute. Really thrilled to present this conversation in partnership with Shindig on Who You Know, innovation that expands students' networks, in this conversation with my friend and colleague, Julia Freeland Fisher, who wrote this excellent book, Who You Know. And excited for the conversation. What we'll do as a format is that Julie and I will have a little bit of back and forth for the first 15 minutes or so. And then we'd love you all to come in with questions either through the chat windows or raising your hand down below, which you can see. And the team will help bring you into the spotlight to ask a question so that we can engage and have Julia answer your questions about this really important, from my perspective, book that she wrote. I think of it as, I've read a lot of books in 2018. I think it's the most important one on education that I've read. And so, Julia, I think that is the perfect segue. Welcome, first of all. And to ask you the question on that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, which is why this book? Why this is the first book obviously you've read. Why did you choose to write this book?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And hopefully everyone can hear me as well. Michael and I talk constantly about the power of technology in education, and it's Murphy's Law that the technology fails while you're doing it. So hopefully the tech will work throughout the hour. And I have one other disclaimer, which Michael also knows as a friend and longtime colleague, which I have two very badly behaved dogs, and I'm working from home, and they've both been fed and shut away, but they are persistent little terrorists. So if you hear dogs, that's them. But back to Michael's original question, why I wrote this book. And I think there's a couple main reasons. At the Clayton Christensen Institute, which Michael co-founded and where I'm now the director of education research, we think a lot about innovations that can create a more student-centered system of education, from K-12 schools all the way up through adult learning. And have for a long time looked at innovations in learning. But when I joined the Institute 5.5 years ago, I had this feeling that we weren't having the conversation about the full spectrum of innovations that can expand opportunity. Because in reality, and most of us in our adult working lives have experienced this, opportunity really sits at the cross-section of what you know and whom you know. It's the combination of what economists and sociologists would call human capital and social capital. And I felt like I wanted to dive into, well, what are the innovations that are expanding students' access to relationships that might otherwise be out of reach? And specifically, in some cases, where does technology have a competitive advantage to do that? Because the past decades have seen this incredible rise of communications technologies that put relationships literally in reach with the press of a button, much like what we're doing today. And yet I wasn't seeing enough attention being paid to those technologies in the education technology conversation. So lastly, I'll just say that I think this is a really crucial conversation for anyone who cares about equity, because I think that there's a sort of slightly insidious or maybe just naive American belief in meritocracy. We are the country, for those of us joining from America, I should say, that has some of the greatest faith in this idea of meritocracy in the entire world. But that idea was actually born only recently in the late 50s from a British sociologist named Michael Young, who actually made up the term meritocracy. It sounds like this age-old thing that has existed for all time. It hasn't. And when you look at the data on who has access to opportunity, everything from career exposure at a very young age to job networks as adults shapes our access to opportunity. And so I wanted to really dig in on, if we care about equity, we have to start talking about relationships.
Yeah, and in the book, you have a terrific section diving into that origins of the term meritocracy and how it came up in some ways as a spoof, which was fascinating to me in terms of a parody. And I think you're right that the Christensen Institute historically we've done a lot about what you know, and sort of ignored this huge equation that's far more predictive in many cases, particularly once you're at a baseline of your life success of who you know. But it leads me to the next question I'd love to hear you reflect on, which is, we're awash in social media tools. So I can imagine how disruptive innovation, right, coming to this topic for the first time, has something to say about building social capital, given all the social media that's out there. But I'm curious how these fit into schools and universities, because the dialogue right now is not necessarily positive around a lot of these tools. So I'm curious how you think about that at the moment.
Yeah, so Michael spared me asking that question in the way that most people ask it, which is, oh, does this mean every student should have a LinkedIn profile? And I'm not here to sort of bash LinkedIn or celebrate them particularly, but that's such a sort of shallow version of the phenomenon that we wanted to look at. And that's an important point for a couple of reasons. So when we first started out, I had the concern that every researcher has at some point on a weekly, if not daily basis, that I was just going to like fade into obscurity. Because why would this be an interesting question to ask in 2018 when we have the likes of Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and young people of all ages are more connected than ever before to these technologies? And when I started to dig in on the data, there's certainly evidence that people are forming new connections online. That's pretty undeniable. But there's also pretty compelling evidence that a lot of these tools, and Facebook is a prime example of this, are in fact being used to sustain our offline networks. So an average Facebook friend or Facebook user knows 93% of his friends in real life. And what that tells me is that that tool is being used primarily to digitize your offline connections. Now, that doesn't mean, because I would anticipate this question from an erudite enough crowd to join this conversation, that doesn't mean that Facebook is not at all disruptive, but what we concluded is that a tool like Facebook and even arguably LinkedIn is really most powerful at disrupting what's called the decay rate of our friendships. Put differently, you are currently in touch with people that you probably should have fallen out of touch with by now, but these tools have allowed us to keep those folks in our orbit, and that's really powerful. It means that I can shoot a message out to all of my former high school and college friends and get information back very quickly from them or gain access to opportunities. But if you look at the data on access to networks in the first place, my concern is that these tools are not opening new access points for people otherwise possibly shut out of certain professional networks, certain networks based on race and class, certain networks based on geography. And so I find myself not totally dismissive of existing mainstream social media tools as a tool in our toolkit, but really excited about an emerging set of ed tech tools that are actually putting students in new relationships with people they might otherwise not meet.
Now, so I'm gonna push you on this a little bit, because you obviously have done a big thing at whoyouknow.org. I think I have the website correct, where you've chronicled well over 100, I think, at this point, of these tools that actually, in a variety of pathways in schools, actually help students build new networks that they wouldn't be. So, right. So if LinkedIn or Facebook is really supporting my existing networks, you've started to focus on a whole host of tools that can actually allow me to build networks I never otherwise would have, get exposure to fields I never otherwise would have, and maybe connect to mentors and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about those tools and how they're different, maybe, from the common ones that we use in our everyday life, and the specific hook to schools and universities themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So on this database, and like Michael said, it's at whoyouknow.org. And this was just the fodder for our research for the book. And we just decided to share it with the field because I increasingly get asked sort of, how do I actually implement a sort of network building or network enhancing activity into my classroom or my career services office or my alumni network? And so we wanted to share the tools that were out there, and you can filter by, type of relationship that it puts within reach, and some of the other demographic information, like the sorts of age and grade levels that they're targeted at. But what we started to see were some clusters in that market where education technology entrepreneurs, often in deep partnership with schools and universities, were seeing a market opportunity to either put industry in closer connection with students, so allow students to meet someone working in a profession if they've never met a physicist, or in the case of NEPRIS, one of the tools we highlight in the book, a neurosurgeon. You can log on and meet a neurosurgeon in this online capacity. So that's sort of one bucket of meeting industry experts and professionals. There's a whole other bucket, which anyone working in education would not be surprised by, around mentorship tools and online mentorship tools, primarily kind of cropping up in the college advising and college retention space. So we know that mentors are critical levers, both to get young people into post-secondary and sometimes even more critically to ensure that they persist through, particularly young people from low-income families and who are first-generation students. And so there's sort of an uptick of tools in that market as well. The last market is a little more amorphous, but in some ways the most exciting to me when we think about all of the human capital in the world and the way that you could pool it into our educational institutions. And it's kind of a mix of academic supports and just human supports. My favorite example from this bucket of the market is a tool called Granny Cloud, which is the brainchild of Sugata Mitra, who's a researcher over in the UK who has done a lot of work in the informal learning space. And what Mitra found was for young children living in the slums of India who were learning through very informal ways, particularly using the internet as a wellspring of knowledge, he saw that they would sometimes falter or sort of need encouragement and realized that he could pair informal learning with what he now calls the Granny Cloud, a cloud of people to step in and support young people, not provide tutoring, not provide academic content, but provide the sort of human support that we all need when we maybe hit a roadblock or face a challenge when we're trying to sort of learn hard material or challenge ourselves. And that to me is this vast bucket of all the ways we could start to connect people who otherwise wouldn't meet to help people make progress, no matter where they live and what their circumstances are.
So I love these examples, and super helpful to start making this more concrete about how there's really the disruptive power to start to change this equation. But it begs the other side of the question, I think, and maybe let's start with higher ed first, and then we can go to K-12, which is what should colleges, as they're starting to think about their advising, mentoring, career services, et cetera, how should they start to think about this? And the question I'd love you to invite you to think on as you answer is not only how should they think about this, but why should they think about it? Why is it important for a college to be attending to this question?
Yeah, absolutely. So embedded in my answer to your last question is like some real wonky stuff that if folks are interested in, we can get deeper on, which is that different relationships really offer different value in our lives. Relationships are not these like monolithic things or, just sort of like dial a random expert randomly. The distinction we drew in the book and that really applies to some of these emerging tools in the technology market is that we have what sociologists call strong ties in our lives and we have weak ties. Michael, I would say is a strong tie. Some of you by the end of this session, I might do the honor of calling a weak tie, but I can't see many of your faces, so we'll see. But the point is, like, that can sound like a value judgment. Our strong ties tend to be those that we trust more, that we have closer relationships with, higher levels of trust. But the kind of counterintuitive fact is that sociologists have also found that there's this sort of so-called strength of weak ties, that weak ties tend to be more diverse. We maintain more of them at once because it takes sort of less emotional bandwidth than time, and they tend to contain diverse information. So you're actually more likely to find a job through your weak tie network. Now, that dovetails into what I want to say about sort of what could colleges start doing today. I think that in the college space, there's sort of two domains where relationships are starting to get more traction. And one is around kind of career advising and the other is around this retention mentorship conversation. And I caution when a college looks at the landscape of sort of all the tools and interventions there's both the temptation to use technology to shore up strong tie gaps. And I think that's a mistake. If a student needs a web of face-to-face support, that's a very different set of interventions than an online connection or coach. But the flip side of that is that I think colleges can be far more savvy, given the technology at our disposal today, around all the ways they could start to diversify their students' weak tie networks into a wide range of industries and professional opportunities. So I think really having a split screen approach to the different types of innovations out there and the different benefits they could have, I think is promising and kind of nuances what right now feels like these two big buckets of retention and career as opposed to a spectrum of connections. And that shift, I think, is key, again, going back to my original point, particularly if we care about equity, but frankly, if we care about all of our graduates thriving.
So that makes a lot of sense. So basically, as opposed to thinking about advising or career services sort of in their own silo, the question shifts to, if you need support to make sure you're going to complete, you probably need some strong ties around you, some real support on the ground, caring relationships that really get to know who you are, your goals, your circumstances. Whereas if you're in this sort of career exploration mode, want the happenstance of finding the right connection that has access to a job or a career you maybe never would have known had existed, that's where those weak ties come into play. And there are a whole set of tools that are honed, if you will, intentionally or probably often unintentionally, much more around that question. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the almost first principle of this, which I think is a mindset shift across the spectrum of education reform and innovation right now that I'm single-handedly trying to make happen, is if we start to think of relationships as an outcome unto ourselves, you're probably already generating your students' networks. You probably have a whole host of assets already at your disposal. You probably also have a lot of opportunity you're leaving on the table, whether that's through project-based learning with industry experts, whether that's really rethinking career services with this lens of relationships in mind. And so I think there's a first principle of like, what is our relationship strategy as an institution? What are all the ways we could be seeding these? And then an understanding of some of the most promising innovations that we try and highlight in the book and in our further research on this.
So let's go to the K-12 side of the equation. And before I do, I'll just say to the folks, I've got one or two more questions that I am burning to get through. And then I could certainly riff with Julia for an hour if that's what we end up doing. But if you all have questions, you can start to enter them into the chat window, notify through raising your hand, and we can start to get to those. And the only emphasis I will make is that just make sure your questions end with question marks, so that they are truly questions and not sort of statements. But Julia, on the K-12 side, I'm curious how this does or doesn't change from the higher ed equation. And I guess I'm curious in two ways. Well, maybe transactionally what they should be doing. But second, we put a lot in our K-12 schools. And certainly if they're interested in life success, I totally get why this is a critical part. But how are they going to have the capacity, I guess, to start to take this on as well as a whole separate stream of work potentially?
Yeah, so I guess I'd start where I ended my last answer, which is like K-12 schools, in some ways more than colleges because of the developmental needs of their students, deal in relationships every day, right? And a lot of K-12 teachers you talk to, it's actually why they got into the profession in the first place. So I think it's dangerous to sort of act like we're starting from zero when it comes to the relationship potential within a school environment. I think I would also say, though, to make a less practical and a more moral argument, K-12 schools, yes, have a lot on their plate, but we also have a basically stagnant achievement gap in our nation across our K-12 schools. And part of what we argue in the book is that until we integrate around sort of networks of care and flood those networks of care with more resources in the K-12 system, we are not going to see those achievement gaps budge in the way that I think we have a lot of political will around, but that we haven't actually seen happen under current policy. So I think that there's a moral imperative. And I think the last piece of like what you were asking around, what's the difference between what you would do maybe either from a developmental standpoint or just strategically in K-12 versus higher ed. The research shows how important career exposure is in shaping career ambitions. And the reality is that if you look at how parents who graduated college are disproportionately networked into the knowledge economy, we have young people growing up with vastly different exposure to different career paths. Some of Raj Chetty's work, formerly at Stanford, now I guess he's at Harvard, but looking at sort of the jagged landscape of opportunity in the country, highlighted what he and his team dubbed lost Einsteins, which was that if you looked at career exposure among young people, particularly to the innovation economy, in elementary school, you could predict who became inventors. And this gets back to my point about meritocracy. Sorry, I'm back on my meritocracy soapbox for a second. But one of the staggering statistics they found was that high aptitude, low income young people testing high in third grade were 10 times less likely to become inventors or sort of join the innovation economy than their mediocre aptitude affluent peers. So we're actually losing as a nation immense swaths of human capital because we're not addressing these social capital differences, I would argue, early enough or often enough. And so I think there's a real argument to be made. Again, like, I think this is a moral imperative, but there's also a practical economic argument about the value that we're leaving as a country on the table if we don't integrate this into what it means to be a K-12 school system. And there's some school systems really picking up the mantle on that. Cajon Valley out in California is probably the boldest experiment that has gone really, you're doing career exposure from kindergarten onwards, and really thought about their curriculum in tandem with that. So that's I don't point to that as the only way of doing it. I think there's lighter touch ways to do that, but it's a real reason to pay attention to this early in a way that's broad, as opposed to, once you're working with college students who are increasingly adult learners, you may be doing much more targeted, building their networks out in the industries in which they want to pursue work.
Gotcha. So I have a couple more questions, but we actually have one that just came in from the audience. So why don't we go out there if we want to bring them up. Chris, I'll let you bring them up for that question.
Okay, so we just read it. We're not going to talk it. Okay, where do alumni fit into this?
Sorry, I'm not seeing the questions on my side. Why don't you read it out loud? Yeah, go ahead.
Question: where do alumni fit into student success in the model being discussed here? Are there specific positive examples or clear best practices in post-secondary institutions especially? Yeah, so this is a place where I'm pretty excited about the potential of technology to start to diversify the ways in which alumni interact with one another and with current students. A couple tools that we highlight on that Who You Know market map specifically target that. Alumni Fire is one, People Grove is another. And what I think they're helping colleges to do, to get to your sort of what's the best practices, is they're helping them to think about the numerous types of touch points and the different dosages of interaction that alumni could have with one another and with students. And what I mean by that is that unlike sort of the version that I experienced, or the kind of what I think was sort of like 1980s alumni cocktail reception model of like, okay, you go and schmooze and then you maybe like awkwardly ask them for a job. This is becoming an area where students could reach out and ask for a brief interaction with an alumni, with a bunch of alumni, and form some of those weak ties. And then if there's an alum with whom there's sort of a real opportunity, go deeper. But there's actually a chance to go broad first, which I think has been a struggle historically. The other thing I'd say there is an opportunity I wonder about that has been less explicit in what I've found out there, which is the opportunity for the Career Services Office, the Academic Advising Office, and the Giving Office to actually see the pie grow bigger by coming up with new ways to engage alumni using some of these platforms. Like right now, those departments are highly siloed. But again, if you think of this as a relationship strategy as opposed to in those discrete categories, I think you come up with new ways to engage alums. Last thing I'll mention is that there are some people, Alumni Toolkit is one of them, who are operating at the K-12 level as well. Which I think is really interesting. Like we don't think of K-12 schools necessarily, maybe some prep schools do, but I think having sort of alum that can be tapped into to provide informal college advice, to provide career networks. And some of these technologies are making it much easier to manage those cohorts. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I also think about your point, and then we have a video question in a moment, so we'll go out to that. But I just thinking about this, even I think of myself as having grown up in a community and family with a lot of these opportunities. And Julia's heard me say this a number of times, but I never met an engineer until I was in college. I just literally never had access to that growing up in Washington, D.C. I did know a lot of think tank people, so maybe not surprising I started a think tank. But, anyway, we have a video question, so enough about me. And Jeffrey, you're live, so why don't you go ahead and ask it?
Ooh, I feel so special. Hi, thanks for the great conversation so far. Really appreciate it. One of the questions I have is I feel like so many of the alumni student discussions are around tell me about a typical day. and they're not authentic. What best practices are you seeing to create those authentic catalysts for conversation between students and alumni? And are you seeing things like micro internships play into this to drive authentic engagement, again, between students and alums?
Yes, love this question. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm going to give a wonky, researchy answer first and then a practical one. So I just want to show that I'm self-aware that I'm going to start off wonky here. So my wonky answer is there's this anxiety that comes into play with anyone who's managing the sort of career services, alumni network stuff of like, what if students don't know how to like interact in the right professional way to have a positive interaction in the first place with an adult working in industry? Like sort of how do we scaffold these interactions to be professional enough and, to your point, productive? And there's a phenomenon in sociology called homophily, which is essentially that birds of a feather flock together. So similarity breeds trust. And one of my big hypotheses in the book is that one of the things that happens when we're sort of choreographing mentorship relationships or job shadows or these sort of informational interviews is that we start off emphasizing difference and we don't plant the seed of trust. And that can isolate both parties, frankly. And so thinking about, from a best practice standpoint, how are you encouraging students to surface things about themselves and encouraging alumni to surface things about themselves that might not be readily apparent, but that could be the seeds of trust? Because otherwise, the thing I worry about, not just from an institutional standpoint, but from the student's experience, is a negative interaction can be worse than no interaction at all, right? So if you get shut down, you actually may lose ground in sort of forging a positive and diverse network for that student. So that's the wonky, like, how do we form trust as human beings that we could embed into these interactions answer. To your other point, though, what are some more varied ways to engage? I think micro internships is a fascinating one. Michael actually is on the advisory board of an organization called, I actually never know how to pronounce it, NOD or Node, that has thought a lot. Which one is it?
Node, yep.
Node, KNOD, that has thought a lot about sort of employer-based learning, using technology as the interface, sort of not necessarily making students go into workplaces. And I think obviously the questions there around micro internships is sort of, are you getting credit for them or how are you structuring them? I'm on a new kick around, are we going to disrupt internship models with feedback models? Because one of the things with internships is that we're putting the onus on the employer or the internship host to be the educator or the faculty de facto, right? We want them to sort of teach students the skills that they need, and that's a big burden. My hypothesis is that it could be really exciting for employers to give feedback on authentic student work. And that could be both the seed of a relationship and a moment of feedback, but it actually lessens the burden on the employer. So that would be one question I would have of, like, as you think about engaging alumni, are some of them willing to just give 15 minutes of feedback? And maybe that stays as just 15 minutes of feedback. Maybe that becomes sort of a weak tie acquaintance. Maybe it turns into a strong tie. But you've actually opened the door to an even lesser commitment with maybe the same potency of substance.
No, and I think that's a great point, because Node's an interesting one. I know our team here at Parker Dewey is doing a ton with Purdue on this and other schools, because they're saying the feedback is so valuable, not just to the students, but also to the programs themselves. That way, Purdue, in the philosophy class, for instance, can highlight to students those crosswalks between the research and the communication and the analytical thinking skills that they're getting in the classroom and how they apply their real world, and can use that real-time feedback from the employers to better counsel students and think about sort of readiness without taking away the academic freedom. So thank you. Really appreciate the answer.
And I think thinking about readiness, Michael may hate this comment, but I'm just going to make it anyways. I think thinking about readiness in a way that the competency-based conversation has gotten stuck, because we want to have these like beautifully fully baked competencies that are kind of just like standards with the new little outfit on. But like readiness, to your point, is articulated in the moment of feedback, right? You actually know whether someone's ready when you see their authentic work and you can give them authentic feedback. So I think it's a whole other way to like start to enter into the competency-based conversation, but from a place of authentic feedback. So
Yeah, no, I actually love it, and it also goes to one of my favorite points as well, which is anything that reduces friction, that helps students have experiences that reduce the friction for employers. I think from a long-term perspective, this will just allow schools and employers to communicate better about skills. So that we're not sort of having this crosstalk conversation right now where employers are talking in one language that frankly doesn't make much sense, and schools are talking in another language that doesn't add up. And I think a lot of the skills gap, not all of it, but a lot of it is because this two different languages are sort of inarticulate with each other. So I think this could go some measure towards starting to tackle that as well. And I think we have another question right now, but a text question. So, Chris, let's bring that up. And it's from Michael, who we know. Everyone can get behind the idea generally, but implementation requires money, time, and energy. So how have you seen innovators build support for networking initiatives in their school communities?
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you, but not your face. So I think it's a really good question, and it's why I'll say, like, I started off thinking I was writing a book about technology. It kind of morphed into a book about institutional design. So how do you actually design an institution with networking as an outcome in mind? And by the end, I had sort of whittled this little soapbox about we have to think of relationships as outcomes. Otherwise, this is never going to sort of fully take off. We have to acknowledge, frankly, how many of us got to where we are today and start to invest more deliberately in all students' networks. So I think it's a valid question. What I am seeing from where the resources are flowing has a lot to do with those categories I was naming started to crop up around the market mapping activity we were doing, which is sort of the energy behind project-based learning, the energy behind sort of academic supports and encouragement, the energy behind retention, are all sort of nodes of demand in the market where people are actually willing to put dollars on the table. Now, they may not be explicitly paying for relationships, they're paying for interventions, but those dollars are putting relationships within reach for students. So that's like one way to think about the resource question. I guess this is a more philosophical conversation we could have over coffee in Bethesda, because I know you're my neighbor. But I think there's also a sort of zero-sum mentality that we have to get past, because part of what the book and the research is about is saying there's a lot of latent social capital being left on the table because of how we've designed our institutions. So of course this is going to cost money, but I also think the bang for your buck, if you start to bring more people into the fold of your K-12 or post-secondary institution to be resources for students, the better. And so I guess I just want to push on what I think sometimes turns into like a zero-sum balance sheet conversation.
And I'll just add a couple other thoughts for what they're worth. And Julia, you can respond, react, disagree. But I do think one of the things that I took from reading your book was how do we responsibly create schools that are more permeable to those outside relationships, in the sense that we architected schools. You use the John Dewey phrase in the book, this embryonic community, if I have that right, which was sort of closed off from the outside. And so I think about this as how do you create a more permeable membrane between school and the outside in a safe way that harnesses a lot of that, as you said, latent social capital. And then the second thing I think a lot about is, Julie, for those of you that don't know, Julie and I wrote a paper together called The Educator's Dilemma, which really started to get into some of these questions about how if schools wanted to have academic success for all students, they were going to actually have to integrate backward into all these domains that historically had not been thought of as necessarily the purview of schools, not just social capital, but healthcare, which of course social capital actually benefits your health, but all sorts of things like that. And you could very easily say, wow, that sounds really costly. And yet from a societal perspective, I think the argument would be, no, actually, when you integrate these completely, and if you look at the balance sheet in totality for society, it's going to actually be very dirt cheap if we do it right, because you're going to save all these lifelong costs that right now come on the balance sheet of America, but don't get charged, if you will, to our schools. They get charged to jails and social services and all these other things that we spend on. curious your take, Julie, and then we have a video question after that.
Yeah, and I would say, just to Michael's question of like who are the innovators in that space, there's actually a lot of like pretty exciting innovation starting to bubble up, and it's kind of like collective impact 2.0 work at the level of cities and communities. But the By All Means group out of that Paul Revel is running out of Harvard Graduate School of Education has cohorts of cities that are really trying to sort of integrate around the needs of the young person in a much more coherent way than our siloed system right now does. A group called City Connects is getting phenomenal results and has done fairly rigorous cost benefit analysis with Columbia Teachers College to prove out the exact point Michael just made, that like this pays for itself and then some, threefold in fact in their case. So I think paying attention to those innovators who are working within a lot of the confines of public dollars, but trying to do it in a more integrated way to get better results.
And with that, why don't we? With that, why don't we go to John on the video question? John, you may be on mute, John. Yeah, there we go. I think ended up with a text question. Okay, so John says, how should an institution help students who may not be thinking in terms of, quote, relationship building as a part of their learning, or who may not be seeking learning relationships?
Yeah, good question, John. And I feel like I kind of get this a lot, that there's this funny thing. So networking, let's just take a step back. Networking as a word, I am a lifelong introvert, right? Even this makes my palms sweat, and I'm not even like in the room with you guys. So networking, I think, has certain connotations that are sort of schmoozy and cocktail party-ish and all that, that I think people are sort of like, well, do we need to teach kids how to network? And I think our argument in the book is that there is an outgrowth of both instructional models and broader educational institutional models that put students into relationship. And that from there, we can have the networking skills conversation. But I worry if we sort of try to teach networking or teach students how to appreciate networks in a vacuum from putting them into relationships. So that's like kind of a broad philosophical point. It actually harkens to the skills content debate in the learning sciences world, where it's like we can't just teach networking skills in a vacuum from actual relationships. However, that being said, I think that it's really important that this is contextualized in both what the developmental research tells us around what relationships are experienced as at different phases of particularly youth development, and that we sort of scaffold accordingly, right? So the Search Institute, which is a phenomenal research think tank out of Minnesota that has looked at the role of relationships in development for decades, has a really helpful framework around the different tenets of a developmental relationship, and how when you're putting young people into a relationship with new adults, particularly, how to kind of scaffold those interactions, so that we're not just assuming that right off the bat, the kid understands that this person could give you a job 20 years from now. That's a little too much foresight. But that we're also arming adults with sort of appropriate understanding of where that young person is developmentally. And then over time, one of the great examples in their framework is like over time, as that relationship sort of blossoms, one of the indicators they look for is there an ability in that relationship to share power? Like that's a great example. If you think about some of your mentoring relationships over the years, right? Like, and I'll put Michael on the spot for this, right? Like Michael was my boss, and like gradually he has learned to share power with me and I with him. And that's a process. But I think having some of that scaffolding in mind is really important. And I'll also harken back though to my wonky comment about homophilia and trust. I think if we're not thinking about seeding trust, then the liability of students not entering these relationships with an understanding of their potential long-term value grows. Because if I sort of inherently trust someone, they can act a little weird or unprofessional or fill in the blank, and that's not a liability. But if I don't trust them, it actually could be. So those are probably like a little bit wonky answers, but it's how I think about not over rotating on sort of teaching networking and more creating contexts where appropriate sort of relationships can develop over time.
Yeah, and that sense of organic relationships, I think, feels better to most people also, because even the extroverts don't always love the intentional, it's networking time, right? Sort of dynamic. Bleeds into a next question that I have, and just so folks have a sense of time, we've got about 15, 20 minutes left or so in the session. So if you have other questions, please get them in now. Otherwise, I will take up all the airtime with my questions. But Julie, I'm curious, if we go to the human side of this, you must have seen some pretty cool stories in your research of schools, students that have been impacted in some pretty neat ways through this research and these notions. Just wondering if you could share a couple just to make it intensely human. I think a lot of us, when we think about the work we do, we keep a student in mind, and it sort of motivates us. And I'm curious where that comes from in your research right now.
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with one that is really, truly random, but a guy named Bear McCreary. I don't know if folks have heard of him. He's a fairly famous composer right now, and he's scored everything from The Walking Dead to was it Cloverfield Lane to like Outlander. Anyways, all these like shiny shows. But Bear McCreary has a story that illustrates to me the power of institutional design and the power of sort of the chain reaction of a network. He was in high school. He was sort of a self-professed bored, cocky teenager and went to a Rotary luncheon, of all things, which sounds about as like old as he is, if that makes sense. It dates him very specifically to a particular era in the American landscape. And, you know, he was being talked about by the presenter, and he told people about his interest in scoring movies and soundtracks and all that stuff. And afterwards, this guy comes up to him, and Bear admits that he like didn't want to be there, that he was bored and all that. This guy comes up to him named Joe Coons afterwards and is like, I think you should meet my friend. And literally Bear McCreary is sitting there thinking like, I don't want to talk to this old guy. Like, this is so awkward. I want to go back to school. And he says, you know, it's a friend who sometimes sails up here. He lived in Washington State. His name is Elmer Bernstein. So anyone who knows the composer world knows that Elmer Bernstein is like the composer of the last generation when it comes to scoring films and TV shows and all that. And so Joe Coons eventually introduces Bear to Elmer Bernstein, who becomes his protege. Bear becomes Elmer's protege until Elmer passed away in 2004. And the story is so profound for a couple reasons. One is that when Bear tells this story, he calls it a cosmic coincidence. And that, I think, is a lot of the ways that we think about networking right now, other than the schmoozy cocktail party creepy people who are like way too deliberate. But we think about these like chance encounters. But if you unpack what actually happened there was an institution at the heart of that interaction, this Rotary Club. And there was also a sort of chain reaction of meeting someone who could help you find sort of the person who would eventually mentor you. And to me, it was actually such a testament to an institution that took the chance out of chance encounters. And also a really good reminder of how a teenage boy experienced that. Right. And so to me, it just, I think we need to think about institutional designs that take the chance out of chance encounters for more young people. And that like really sticks with me, again, knowing that this book really morphed into not so much a book about technology, but if technology could help us take the chance out of some of those chance encounters. So sorry, that was long-winded, but I think we can all think of moments in our lives like that. But I think it has all the nuances of like an invisible institutional infrastructure and a person who can help you find people who can help you. And imagining all of the lost opportunities to do that right now in our system, because school is so insular, because networks are so segregated by geography and class and race.
So this is another question on the human side of it. Before I go with my last question for you on this, and again, if folks have questions, I'll defer to you rather than me. Please don't be shy. But the question on I guess I'm curious is, how did you originally get interested in this area, this research area? Because as we've said, this hasn't been the thrust of ed reform over the last couple decades by any stretch of the imagination. There have been some shining books about the importance of social capital, of course, Bob Putnam and others. have written about it, but it's been largely overlooked. One of the reasons I'm personally so excited about this book is I think a lot of the books that have documented the importance of social capital have been very light on solutions and what do we do about it. And here we have a book that I think very tangibly gives schools a way to jump into it. But I'm curious, you personally, what's the story behind the story? Where did this come from for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I feel like I always give different answers to this question. So I need to maybe tighten it up a little bit. But I think, so I started my career at an organization called New Schools Venture Fund right out of college, which is a venture philanthropy that funds entrepreneurs in sort of the public school space. And at the time, the emphasis was like all on the achievement gap. But I had a colleague named Alex Bernadotte, who became an entrepreneur in residence and has since founded an organization called Beyond 12, which is on that market map I mentioned, and doing phenomenal work helping low-income students persist through college using a mix of face-to-face and online coaching. And she, I would credit her with being one of the first people I met, and I think one of the first people in the field to see the profound opportunity at the intersection of sort of technology and innovation and human support, and to not put those at odds with one another. So that really planted the seed. And then I think fast forward, my husband, as Michael knows, had worked in the military right out of college, and has an interesting story in that he had never met a single person who had been in the military before joining it. And can tell tales of what that meant for his first 6 months on the job, just like having no idea what's going on. But I think seeing him live through that experience gave me an appreciation of sort of how people navigate spaces in which they don't know anyone, and what the opportunities and drawbacks are of that. And so he was my co-author in this book, partly because I think he really came around. He came out of the military being one of these purist meritocracy people. But really came around to the fact that this is the way opportunity works across a whole variety of American institutions. So again, that it goes from very personal to very, I think, pragmatic and moral. So
no, super helpful. I mean, I know one of the reasons one of the reasons as I came to understand what you were going to write about, and this is going into backstory that maybe you all don't know, but when I first interviewed her to come to the Christensen Institute, sort of my throwaway question at the end was, and what would you personally want to work on if you came here? And she was very clear that social capital was it. And I don't think I had a full sense of how encompassing it could be. But as I came to, understand it, certainly in my career, there's no doubt that it's been entirely guided by who I've been lucky enough to have encounters with, and they took foolish risks on me, and it worked out. So it certainly resonates. And I think as people tell the story of their lives, the importance of it can't be overstated. Michael, who asked the earlier question, asked another question that goes to, I guess, my last one, and then maybe we'll go into John, and then we'll have maybe the last word. But his question is, how do policymakers and leaders start to point to measures? He said, specific return on investment for this work. But I would say more broadly, should we be measuring? Should schools be measuring this? What are the perils of doing so, and what are the upsides of doing so? And is it a necessity in your mind, or is it sort of a input into something greater?
Yeah, so I approach the measurement conversation with sort of cautious optimism. I think measurement R&D typically lags innovation in a lot of cases, right? So there aren't super sophisticated measures out there that I would necessarily say we should write into state legislation tomorrow. But I think there's an intermediate phase of schools and institutions taking stock, taking a baseline of what are your students' social assets, and where do they have ambitions where they don't actually know anyone who could help them reach those ambitions, and do some mapping around that. And in the book, we talk about, this has been going on in social work for decades. This is not a new approach, but sort of relationship mapping. that can allow, I think, both students to have visibility into who they know and really think of those folks as assets, to one of the earlier questions, but then also allow institutions to be strategic about, okay, are there certain industries where our student body would really benefit from a more robust network, and can we partner accordingly? So that's one sort of relationship mapping is one bucket of this. Another bucket for this applies a little more to K-12 schools, but maybe some smaller post-secondary institutions, is an exercise that was developed out of Harvard's Making Caring Common project, in which you put up a roster of all of your students and have the adults in the building or in the institution put stickers next to those students with whom they feel like they have a close relationship. And it reveals some really interesting things, right? There are young people in schools today with whom no adult in that school has experienced a close relationship, and that should be a cause for concern for everything from safety to mental health to academic thriving. And so laying bare that data to faculty and to teachers, I think can be really useful and allow schools to sort of develop a relationship strategy from within. The last thing I'd say around this is, like, there's sociology measurement work around what's called name generators, where you have students or you have anyone sort of list out, you say, do you know a lawyer? Do you know a policeman? And you have students sort of generate names along various categories of people. I think that can be useful. I think one of the things I learned through my research, though, is that in the mentoring community, there's fairly mixed feelings about those exercises as well as mapping exercises if you don't have a strategy in place to address where students may have gaps, because it can be very pathologizing, right? Michael didn't know an engineer, right? And if you didn't have a solution to meet an engineer, that can just feel, that can inspire despair. So I think approaching measurement with caution, for all the reasons we already approach measurement with caution in the education space, but particularly knowing that this is, very personal, I think, to students and families, and approaching it with that lens, I think, is important. The last thing I'll say, maybe just feeling self-conscious about my LinkedIn point at the beginning. Two things on LinkedIn. First of all, Jeffrey Moss already connected with me on LinkedIn. So this is proof that, connections can happen on LinkedIn, but you may need programs and institutions like this Shindig conversation to spark those. It can, I'm more likely to now respond to Jeffrey because we've had this interaction and he's not just a random request on LinkedIn. So I just want to point that little point out. The other thing around measurement, though, there's some institutions, Big Picture Learning among them. Big Picture Learning is runs internship-based learning at the high school level, who are thinking really critically about LinkedIn as a place to store the connections that students sort of accrue as a result of their internships, but also have those internship posts offer endorsements on LinkedIn, and using that as a measure of not just are we crashing students together with adults and calling those connections, and not just even counting those, but actually seeing, is there sort of a albeit informal credentialing happening through something like an endorsement? And I think that's a really interesting emerging measurement space using some of the tools that already exist in the market, and have meaning in that market, as opposed to starting from scratch.
Super helpful, I think. And I guess my headline is, yes, measure, but tread cautiously as you do so. But
that's an annoying answer, right? We get to say that because it's
but the point is, we shouldn't be going out and rushing out to create ROI measures right now, because there could be some pretty unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think, if anyone from a foundation is on this, hi, first of all, but second of all, I think we need R&D in that space desperately. And it would be putting the cart before the horse to start, counting people in networks sort of willy-nilly.
Terrific. And then your last point on LinkedIn, I think, leads into the last question that we'll have for this session from Jonathan Ports, who asks that he makes the point that he's curious about the role of technology. If, as you said earlier, it at the moment mostly goes to decreasing the decay rates on ties, then the short-lived nature of the tools one hears about, he says, seems important. So, for example, if today Facebook is fading among young people, then that won't keep ties potentially from decaying in the longer run. Does that mean that higher ed should teach higher level skills of the internet worked world? And his example is build a website, don't join LinkedIn because HTML is forever, but LinkedIn is not, that sort of thing. Given the example you just said, maybe that's not the conclusion, but would love you to riff on that as we wrap up.
I think it's a really important question that, like, knowing that the tools themselves may come and go, and so the sort of idea that in perpetuity my digital Rolodex lives over here may be a flawed mental model. So I really appreciate the point. And to be honest, it's not something I've thought a ton about, but I do think that helping students to understand how to use all of those strategically is probably a worthwhile exercise that isn't happening in a lot of places. And I also would say that I'm a little more interested in technology less as a digital Rolodex and more as a way to forge connections across time and space that weren't possible before. So that's where, like, we conclude in the book, technology has a competitive and disruptive edge relative to our inherited networks, is to reach beyond time and space. The sort of separate point about decay rates is, like, it's also great to reach beyond time and space when you're trying to maintain a network. But I am more excited, to be honest, about technology's sort of relationship forging potential. And I think we'll always come up with formal and life hack ways to sort of maintain our networks, whether it's on the current tools or later ones. I do think it does, and now I'm just talking out loud, I'd be curious to hear Michael's thoughts. Like, it begs some of the same questions in the credentialing space that are happening right now. So if you're betting on LinkedIn, both as a networking tool and a credentialing tool, like, what does that mean if LinkedIn disappears? So, but it's a really good question. And for whoever asked it, I would love to geek out offline later if you have thoughts.
Yeah, and I guess my take is probably similar to where you started, which is teaching how these are all just tools, and so giving people the logic and the ability to navigate the different tools, and the tools may change, but being able to navigate them is important. And I think in terms of the credentials question, which is a part, obviously, from the network question, having tools that become digital repositories that, your credential from such and such organization, that organization may go, but your credential showing you can know and do something maybe persists because of it's locked in either a blockchain type application or a Credly or something like that allows it to be preserved. Different conversation entirely. Whether credentials do that today.
Just to end on, like, a note of, this is a lot more just like the green space I'm thinking in right now, and I don't have conclusions, but I mentioned big picture learning. One of the founders, Elliot Washer, has sort of morphed into a mentor to me as I've done this research, and he is super articulate on this phenomenon that I didn't think of until after I wrote the book. There's like a running list of things I wish I'd included, but one of the things that matters is not what you know or who you know, it's who knows what you know. And credentials are a proxy for that. But thinking about different ways to ensure that the people who need to know what your students know what they know is kind of the question unfolding in the credentialing space. And one of the reasons why I'm really interested, back to the original question on micro internships, why I think feedback is this really exciting space to play, because that's a chance where people get to know what you know and who you are at the same time.
So that's a perfect segue into my very last question, Julia, which is for people who want to follow your evolving learnings, research, emerging ideas, and learn about what you're thinking about next on the web. How can they find you so they can keep up with all that and whatever will be your next book?
Yeah, well, like, meta to this conversation, you can use all of these different social media platforms to connect with me. So obviously on LinkedIn, my email is jfreeland@christenseninstitute.org. Check out whoyouknow.org if you want to just look for tools. And if you have a tool in mind that's not on there, please send it to me. And on Twitter, I'm at Julia F. Freeland. But yeah, thank you so much for joining. And, as I'm looking ahead, we're really focused over the next 6 months on programs serving 16 to 24-year-old young people furthest from opportunity, to understand the solutions that are being built to shore up their network. So if folks are working in that space, would love to chat.
Well, and I'll wrap up by just saying huge thank you for joining us in the conversation, illuminating a lot of these ideas, for writing the book again. For those listening, buy it, who you know. It is a terrific read, and really, I think, a seminal contribution to the field. So appreciate all that work, Julia. Thank you, of course, to the Christensen Institute for helping this work go forward and get out there into the public arena. And a special thank you to Shindig for facilitating this conversation and having the foresight that their platform could be a terrific place for a conversation around who you know, with being able to see all of you. So huge thanks again all around, and thank you for joining us. Appreciate it very much.